Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. I don't have Don and Stefan with me. For one, I have a different guest. And the origin of this is that, God, it must have been over a year ago now, maybe even 2 years ago. A listener to the show named Patrick McDonald emailed me with an idea and a thought. And the way I remember the thought is that he was talking about, you hear all the time about tons of CO2 and when you're talking about CO2 emissions, and we just use this metric and nobody has any idea what that means, and it's talked about in this very vague way. And he had an idea for a different way of talking about it that I think could be illuminating and actually funny in a lot of ways. So I thought I would bring on Patrick and have him kind of tell us about the original idea, and then for us to discuss what we think the potential of the idea is. So first of all, Patrick, welcome to Power Hour.
Thanks, Alex. Glad to be here.
So yeah, thanks for coming. And I didn't want to steal your thunder. So just in your own words, tell the audience sort of your idea of how we should measure CO2 emissions.
Sure, Alex. Well, a couple of years ago, like you said, I was listening to another energy-related podcast, and on the podcast, they were talking about some new EPA website where you would enter in some personal information like the square footage of your home and how many cars you had, that type of thing. And it would do some type of calculation and spit out your estimated carbon footprint. And the numbers they would put out were, like, I don't know what it was. It was, 30,000 pounds of CO2 in a year. And I noticed that the hosts were having a difficult time discussing their results because the numbers are pretty abstract. You normally, when you think of weight, you think, I put on 5 pounds over the holidays and I got to take it off. And you can relate that to, I don't know, maybe half the weight of a gallon of milk. It's something that fits in your head. And these large numbers just didn't make sense to the host. So I thought you could improve on that. Then that attached to another idea. There was a particularly crude episode of South Park. I don't think we need to go into that too much, but they invented a measurement called the Couric, and we can probably let the listeners look that up if they want to. But anyway, I put those two ideas together and thought we should measure our carbon footprint in a new metric called the Gore for Al Gore.
And why Al Gore?
Well, I think there's, plenty of hypocrisy out there, and chief among the perpetrators is probably Al Gore. We have all these other climate events where a lot of people fly their planes there and just emit unimaginable amount of CO2 to get there, to tell everybody else that we shouldn't be doing it. And, Al Gore is the cheerleader for everything here.
And yeah, in particular, there were different studies that got publicized several years ago talking about how much Al Gore's residence used. And so when you brought up the idea of the Gore, I think part of what's appealing about it is that it's a large amount of CO2 emissions. It's an unusually high amount. And so one thing we've been thinking about is, okay, what exactly should one Gore be? And this is something we're still researching, and definitely with all these ideas, we're interested in listener input. But kind of, I had Stefan on our team do just some almost a little better than back of the napkin stuff, but calculated that for one of Gore's residences, and just one of them in Nashville, it was about 100 metric tons of CO2 a year. And then see if you imagine his other residences, maybe you can double that. And then if you take like his flying, you could guess that at around 75 tons if you just take first class flying. But then if you take private, it's more. But so tentatively we have, and it's hard to guess. And if Al Gore is just willing to give us his accounting, and he can mention his carbon offsets, but I don't think we're really going to count those because those don't scale at all or very well. So we have it at 300 metric tons of CO2 per year is one Gore. So that's the tentative initial measurement of the Gore. And just to give you a sense, the average U.S. citizen uses 1/17 what Gore does. So, Patrick, any thoughts on your part on any other ways of measuring the Gore?
Well, I think, like we discussed before, they're kind of hard to talk about. So using the metric prefix is another way to make it even funnier than it was. So I forget what your calculations were, but that would come out in something like centigores rather than having to say thousandths or something like that.
Right. So we have a one-way trip from JFK to London emits 3.3 milligores, so that's 1,000th of a Gore. And I mean, here's the really interesting ones, I think, are in terms of humans. So the average sub-Saharan African emits 2.8 milligores. So that's basically 3/1000ths of a Gore. And the average human is 1.7 centigores. So that's less than 1/50th of Al Gore. So you can think about there's just all sorts of things, and it's really interesting. So did you see this article I sent you today by Michael Schellenberger?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, so that I definitely disagreed with some of it, including some of the things he said about morality in general. But he was talking about this issue of celebrities and how much they emit, and I do think uh, that can be a valuable thing to expose. So let's see, what do we have? Just looking at this analysis that we have so far. Yeah, so you have like a lot of almost, to emit a Gore, you have to be very, very sort of very, very wealthy and use a lot of machine power. And so if you think about who are the people whose energy use can be measured in anything close, who's anything close to one Gore, it's going to be people like, Leonardo DiCaprio commissioning yachts and having all these private jets. And then these people going to these, there's this Google climate event where they had something like 100 different private jets going. And these are the only people whose energy use can be measured in terms of Gores. The most of us are in centigores. And although I think it's interesting because the Gore should be an aspirational unit. Like if you could imagine a world where everyone emitted one Gore, or at least use that much energy, you would just be talking about an incredibly prosperous world. So I'm curious on your end, Patrick, what do you think are some of the use cases of measuring Gores and exposing different people's Gores?
Well, obviously, we've touched on the hypocrisy line, and there was a good line in that article. It says hypocrisy is the ultimate power move because they think they can get away with it. So being able to call them out and, just get it down on paper somewhere so that everybody can see how much more they're using than we are is important. Beyond that, just general science, it's hard to talk about. Like I said when I listened to that podcast, it wasn't a useful conversation because it didn't make sense to anybody. So having a legitimate unit that we can talk about in individual terms would advance conversations.
Yeah, we didn't get what's the global amount of Gore emissions per year and what happened. Yeah, that would be so. What are some ideas you have about how to popularize this metric?
Sure. Well, the EPA website, I think their point was to do something kind of viral where you would enter your information and, you'd share the results. It's also supposed to put you on a bit of a guilt trip too, but, and teach you what you can do to minimize your carbon footprint. But, I think to popularize the idea from our end would be, something that you could share pretty easily to Facebook. You could enter your own information and get a graphic or something that could be easily shared on Twitter or Facebook to announce your much smaller use of carbon. And then you could also do something where you would just take in articles out there in the industry and translate the numbers over to the Gore, so all those articles could be more easily consumed.
Yeah, you could have like some sort of. I think you have background in programming, so maybe you could just create something where it would just take any article and translate it into Gores.
Right.
Yeah, uh, I like that one. I wonder if the EPA under Trump would actually use this unit. It's probably a better chance than previous or subsequent administrations.
Yes, you're right.
Let me see what else. Any other ideas about how to use this?
Well, let's see. Beyond those two, I mean, you could easily make little memeable versions of it. I think I sent you that joking one from the movie Back to the Future. Um, 1.1 gigawatts. So that would be a pretty humorous one to figure out what uses 1.21 gigagores.
Yeah, that's a good one. So, what do you think is the best way to get started in terms of popularizing it? In terms of like,
Well, yeah,
you want to create a
I was gonna,
website?
yeah, I was gonna say, your listeners could also chime in, and they could always send in articles that they would like to be translated as well into this usage. Um, but yeah, I think a website where you could, yeah, well, it would be harder to make, but something where you could enter in your own individual information and have an individualized report that's easily shareable. I think that's the most likely to become mainstream. The most likely to become viral would be something like that.
Interesting. What do you think about if what if the so do you think we should use the main unit? Should the main unit be the Gore, or should the main unit be something like the milligore?
Um, I think the gore. I think you put it plainly that this is what, like you said before, like it's something to achieve. Like it's almost a way of trash talk. You're nowhere near a gore. So I think it's to set it as something that's nearly impossible for anybody to achieve would be pretty funny.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, who actually? I mean, I think Elon Musk does. I think he would
Sure.
be in that category. I mean, certainly he flies private a lot. Yeah, and the I'm also definitely interested in if any of our listeners have inside information on Gore, on calculating the Gore, because it is tricky to do. And maybe we'll formally invite Al Gore to give us, because he always responds to my invitations. We
Right.
should we should invite him to give us that usage. So I'll just say another thought about why I think this is important, because I'm reluctant to do things that just expose hypocrisy, but I think that this kind of when you're exposing hypocrisy here, what you're really showing is that people who are doing what they view as important things, and what they somewhat understandably view as important things, such as with this climate stuff, what they're mostly doing is they're sharing what they regard as important ideas. Now, I think they're ideas that are important for people to disagree with, but nevertheless, they are that it's true that in order to do important things, you need you know you need a lot of energy to fuel machines that give you capabilities that you wouldn't otherwise have. And so things like the capability to meet with a whole bunch of influential people, even though you don't live anywhere near them, and to have important discussions and to discuss plans, it's just one example. And when you have very limited time because you have a lot of other stuff, so private jets are fantastic, and it's great that people are willing to use a lot of energy and other resources to work on accomplishing important goals. But unfortunately, in this case, the important goal is restricting everyone's access to energy, and therefore all the capabilities that machines give us. And that's where one of the myths that they put forward is that there are significant parts of the world, or significant industries, or significant people that are somehow detached from CO2 emissions, that there are alternatives, and that it's just a matter of we lack the will to use them or something like that. Versus, no, everybody living a modern life in a modern civilization is using fossil fuels, because for the overwhelming amount of ways in which we want uh, to use machines to improve our lives, fossil fuels are by far the most cost effective way, and sometimes the only way to do things. When you're talking about planes, that's essentially true. So what I want to do is, I do want to shame people in a certain way, but I want to shame them from the perspective of you are attacking the achievement that makes so much of what you want to do in life possible. And this is why it can be useful to talk about things like, okay, this is how much, a Hollywood blockbuster film, like how many gores that, were involved in that. And then when you go out to a restaurant, here's what's involved in that. And as a positive, what I want to show people is, yes, we use a lot of energy in every area of life, and most of that energy is fossil fuel energy because that's usually the best type of energy, and that is a good thing. And we should accept that we should accept that we make that choice, that we think if there are any downsides of CO2 emissions, that those are totally worth it because of all the capability, ultimately the capability to flourish that we get from using fossil fuels. So that's my hope. I'm curious for you, Patrick. What do you think about the relationship between hypocrisy and then promoting the positive?
Yeah, I think promoting the positive is definitely important. And I just had another thought about how you could do that too. At the bottom of this, it's all about creating energy. So once the Gore is set as a unit, you could also do a rough translation to watts or some other type of energy output. And that could be a positive way to look at it, to remind people that your emissions are for energy, which makes our lives better, which makes us flourish.
I wonder if people will talk about, the Gore intensity of things, because for different forms of energy, you're going to have different levels uh, of emissions, and it'd be totally fascinating if this if this if this actually worked, and then that's what Gore became known for as a measure of CO2. It does have a nice ring to it, and you've mentioned in our conversations that a lot of the units that we use now are named after people, right? Like watt. What are the others?
Watt, joule, ohm,
Newton.
every Newton. Yeah, you get a bunch of scientific discoveries, and it gets named after somebody in a positive way. So this might be the first time when something gets named after someone negatively.
Okay, awesome. So uh, I want to give some next steps to our listeners, and then we'll talk about any of our next steps before we wrap up. So yeah, for listeners, I'm really interested in any ideas you have, but in particular, I'm interested in any insight you have on how to get the actual statistics of Al Gore as accurately as possible. Another one is, what was the other one I was going to say? Oh, well, what specific Gore calculations are you interested in? So what do you want to know? Like how many Gores for X? For we had sub-Saharan African, the average human. You can have, like we looked at Tesla's global facilities. Those are 486 Gores, although I'm not sure what that encompasses, but according to Tesla's report. So I would imagine that's an understatement. So there's flying first class. So what types of activities are you interested in having Gores for? And then do you have any insight on the terminology, like using milligores and centigores and maybe decigores and that kind of thing? And once we get that information from you, once we get that input, and then of course just any ideas you have about the overall idea. Once we get that input from you, then we can think about setting up a website or something like that and getting started. Patrick, any requests that you have from listeners?
Well, if anybody's high up in Wikipedia and has put a lot of things together, maybe they could create a page on there that explains what it is once we've determined what the Gore unit is.
That's a good point. I think I do know. I think we probably can manage that contact, and then if we share it on the newsletter, then other people will get it. Okay. Any final thoughts, Patrick, besides before we wrap up?
No, I'm just excited to hear what people think about it.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. I will just wrap up this this little mini segment. So it wasn't a full episode. We may do another episode in addition the week that you're hearing this, but as usual, if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email don@industrialprogress.net. Also, if you're interested in any kind of speaking or consulting, you can also email don@industrialprogress.net. Also, to get on our list, go to alexepsteinlist.com so that you get our weekly newsletter, as well as our Energy Clarity course. Thanks again to Patrick McDonald for coming on the show and for generating the idea of the Gore. I'm Alex Epstein. Until next time. Oh, that's the first time I ever botched that. Until next time, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.